Hi, everybody. It's Sunday afternoon here in Paris, and I'm going to record the PowerPoint lecture for tomorrow, March 30th. Give me just a second to pull up the slides. Okay, this one will be a tad bit shorter than the others, I think. We'll probably be finished in about 20 minutes. Your discussions might take a little bit longer, though, but we'll see. Okay. To some extent, this lecture is really a tight partner with the lecture from last time on ritual, since oftentimes anthropologists are looking at ritual and symbol together. And certainly when we do ritual analysis in anthropology, uh, it's rarely done without a close look at the symbols that play a role in those rituals as well. For the readings that you had for today for class, we read chapter 5 from Joe Hendry's book, so Society: A Set of Symbols, and then we read a short piece written by Rebecca Popindo called Ideal that was published in FAT, The Anthropology of an Obsession, which is quite a nice collection of articles actually by anthropologists thinking about fat in a wide range of societies. So we're going to start out with Hendry's text. She begins by defining symbol and symbolic analysis as it's undertaken by anthropologists. Okay, of course, symbolism is something that scholars in many disciplines study, and anthropologists take a particular approach to this. So one definition that Hendry gives is that a symbol is the smallest unit of a ritual. She discusses also at some length in the section on symbolizing relationships the fact that it's also present in gift exchange, which we studied 2 classes ago. Gifts themselves are wildly symbolic, right? Symbolism is of interest to anthropologists because it pervades human behavior. At even the most mundane level, right? So because it's shared across human societies, it then becomes of interest to anthropologists. Hendry reminds us also that symbols can be seen as units of communication, right? In the same way that we saw earlier that gift exchange also is often a system of communication, right? Anthropologists are interested in particular on public symbols or shared symbols, right? Those that are shared by a group, understood within a specific social and moral system, right? Which doesn't mean that the same symbolism may mean something quite different to members of another social group. There can even, as we'll discuss later, there can be differences within a single social group about the symbolic meaning of something. It's not necessarily always shared. Symbols are sometimes negotiated, symbols change, but we're interested in symbols that are shared. So that means if for example, a particular piece of jewelry is very symbolic to me of my relationship to a friend or to my mother. That may be interesting and is interesting in and of itself, but for anthropologists, it only becomes interesting if jewelry in itself becomes symbolic in various kinds of shared ways in a particular group. Okay. Of course, anthropologists are often interested in symbols because they're visible features or visible artifacts of oftentimes invisible aspects of social organization. In other words, they give us insight into systems of classification, and we'll return to this in a couple slides as well. Right? We're obviously interested in the various ways objects, relationships, and so on and so forth become symbols and the different meanings they can take across cultures. Hendry also takes a little bit of time to differentiate between a symbol and a sign. We don't spend a lot of time on this, but briefly, a sign is always less, and she takes this, strangely enough, this particular citation is from her book, and she's taking it from Young. The sign is always less than the concept it represents, while a symbol stands for something more than its obvious and immediate meaning, right? A sign is an object such as a street lamp or street light that has a rather utilitarian meaning, for example, in everyday life, but when it starts to stand for something more in a given context, starts to represent, I don't know, movement or other sorts of things, then it starts to become a symbol in other kinds of ways. She refers to various other works to talk to us about symbols. One of the works that she focuses on is Anthony Cohen's Symbolizing Boundaries. And from this work, she draws on this idea that symbols are malleable, right? They can be made to fit circumstances. They provide media through which individuals and groups can experience and express their attachment to a society without compromising their individuality, right? In other words, symbols are malleable, symbols can change, symbols can be what we call polysemic or have several meanings at once, right? She also cites Victor Turner's work and looks in particular at his book, The Forest of Symbols. You'll remember in the last class on ritual, we looked in particular at the ritual process and the ways in which Victor Turner thinks about rites of passage and the liminal phase in particular. Here she draws from The Forest of Symbols, another work by Victor Turner, and and brings forth the three forms of data that Victor Turner thought was essential to bringing forth or making sense in our analyses of the structure and properties of ritual symbols. So for Victor Turner, we needed one, to note the external form and observable characteristics of the ritual symbol or of the symbol. So, and we collect that data in the field. We write it down in field notes, right? What does this object, for example, look like? What can we observe of how it's used, who it belongs to, um, what kinds of activities it's involved in, so on and so forth. We look for the interpretations that are offered by specialists, so by other anthropologists, for example, if they've seen a similar, oh, sorry, it's Sunday afternoon, a similar symbol in other kinds of places, for example. Historians also might be consulted, but they're also going to be interested, of course, anthropologists in laymen's view, in other words, the people who are involved from that particular society and the use of that symbol. That, of course, is also going to be collected in the field through interviews and through discussions. And then most important, well, not most importantly, but the one that perhaps is often not necessarily thought about by beginning anthropologists is that the significant context must also be worked out by anthropologists. And this is very much about the interpretation or the analysis that anthropologists make of these symbols while they're in the field. Any kind of given ritual or symbolic form within that ritual can often be understood in a variety of different contexts. And of course, anthropologists are always interested in the meaning of something in a particular context, right? We know very well that the meaning of a particular color of skin, for example, if we think back to our classes on race, can mean different things in different societies, right? So we're always looking at meaning as, and in fact, Gertz talks about this as well. We talked about that in the first half of the semester. That meaning is contextual, right? And so Turner once again underlines the same notion, right? What are our contexts and what can we tell about a particular symbol and ritual within a particular context? Sometimes that context might be within the context of a nation state, it might be within the context of a tribe, it might be in the context of certain global processes. There's often a choice to be made about what particular context matters in the analysis of the anthropologist. This means, of course, that the interpretations, and Henry talks about this a little bit, that the interpretations offered by laymen, for example, in the field, what a particular object means, for example, to the people using it, and the kinds of meanings associated with that same object by anthropologists may not always overlap. And so there's obviously lots of questions around this. There's lots of ethical questions. There's lots of interpretive questions around this. and anthropologists generally try to be really clear about what is their interpretation and what's said by laymen. Now, informants may have one interpretation, and it's always a valid one. It's also valid within an analysis for anthropologists within a particular cultural setting to think about other kinds of things that are signaled or reproduced, though are not necessarily consciously so by the people involved in these practices, right? And I think when you discuss Popendow's article in your discussion groups, you're going to see how body size often signals particular gender identities or signals particular social values. And when we shape our bodies in particular ways, we're actually maintaining some of those values or hierarchies without necessarily being aware of that, right? And so analysis does get at sometimes this not necessarily aware. I think Hendry brings up the example from Victor Turner's book here, where he talks about the Madai. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right. The Madai tree among the Ndembu. That's used in a particular ritual for girls' puberty, so the rite of passage of girls going from a girl to woman. And that, if you look back to that, it's on page 93 and 94, I believe, that the tree represents certain things to the participants. They talk, for example, about how it represents the relationship between mother and child and the continuing line from woman to woman, right, which stands for the tribe itself. Um, and then when Turner looks more closely at particular aspects of the ritual and how they're carried out, he also sees that it also symbolizes the separation of mother and daughter as the later reaches puberty, and a separation of women from men, right? That kind of coexists with these other kinds of stated purposes of the ritual, right? And he, of course, gives various kinds of external form and observable characteristics and interpretations offered by other specialists, and a discussion of the context to work out that analysis. So you can take a close look at that on page 93 and 94, but it gives a nice sense of the tension and both the kind of unity, but also the contrast that can exist between number one and number two here in the three forms of data spoken about by Turner. Hendry obviously spends a little bit of time speaking about bodily symbols in her chapter. She kind of talks about the various ways in which we either dress our bodies or shape our bodies or mark our bodies, do our hair, carry ourselves, that signal all sorts of other kinds of system of classification, right? In other words, how we dress, how we shape ourselves, how we're marked, tattoos, for example, communicate. It communicates social identities, it communicates core values and ideas about morality, obviously gender roles and ideals, such things as status, social hierarchies and power. So we'll talk just a tiny bit more about body symbolism, only because Popendow's article is obviously looking at the body as symbol, right? And it's within that realm of anthropology. Now, I should say, for those of you who are really interested in these kinds of ideas, symbolic anthropology is a subfield in anthropology that's quite important. So it's folks that focus on the study of symbolism. The anthropology of gender, of course, also overcuts with many of these issues when we're focusing on the body in particular. And the anthropology of the body is another kind of space. Now, I also chose to focus on the body here only because in a couple classes we'll start reading Seth Holmes' Fresh Fruit and Broken Bodies, and he's going to return to questions of embodiment and the body, both in research and in strawberry fields, actually. So we'll pick up this notion of the body again, though approach it in both similar and different ways than we're talking about here. Now, this is not necessarily discussed by Hendry in the chapter, but I thought I would bring these kinds of notions forth only because I feel that they're both somewhat present. They're both present, not somewhat. They're both present in Popendow's research and in her article. So one way to think about the body as symbol is to think about the body as artifact. And this is by far the most predominant way that anthropologists have thought about the symbolic body, right? From this perspective, and in fact, this is the way that Henry mostly talks about it in that chapter. When she talks about the body being representative of social organization, she's working within this perspective. So, from this perspective, anthropologists focus on the representational or symbolic nature of the body as a conduit, that should read, of social meaning, right? In other words, they look at the ways bodies express systems of classification. So, if you take, for example, a shared idea in a particular society about attractiveness, and bodies are made attractive then to adhere to those ideas in all sorts of ways, these can express and maintain shared sets of values, social hierarchies, gender roles, and so on and so forth. Of course, within this frame, then, if we're speaking about women's bodies, as Popindo does, we can people have examined the ways in which women subject themselves to multiple kinds of dietary, corporal, religious, etc., other forms of discipline in order to adhere to various body ideals. Mary Douglas, a structuralist, for example, argues in some of her work that the body is a text upon which social meanings are inscribed, a very structuralist approach, and one that should remind you of the text that we read from Levi-Strauss earlier in the semester, for example. I'll just mention very briefly Michel Foucault here, a French philosopher who writes quite a bit about the body and has an important impact on anthropology. So he's writing about the body in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and his work has an important impact. And he very much looks in his research as the body as a site for power and control. And we'll return to some of his work when we read Fresh Fruit and Broken Bodies, which is why I just evoke it here. In more recent works, in the past couple decades, scholars, and so anthropologists too, have been thinking instead of the body as an active agent in the social world. From this perspective, our bodies mediate our relationship to the world around us. So a self can act on the world and does so through the medium of the body. And this is linked to notions of embodiment, which we'll get to later in the semester. So bodies, as symbols, can therefore play significant roles in times of social, cultural, political crisis or change, right? They can act as agents of change, transformation, or revolution, for example. So in the 1960s in the US, for example, you had the rallying cry, Black is Beautiful. That was one cry among others that was involved in the civil rights movement, and that was focused on changing societal perceptions of the African American body. Right? So you read an article written by Rebecca Popindo, who I believe did her PhD at the University of Chicago. She did fieldwork for 4 years among desert Arabs in Niger, in the Sahara. Ideal is just a short article that she wrote in a narrative style for a general audience. So you could already think a little bit about her writing style here. I chose it for you so that we would vary the kinds of writing styles that you read during the semester. I feel like it's well written and an engaging style. I'd love to know what you think about it. And she's also trying to write for a general audience, so you can see the ways in which she tries to do that. Now she's drawing, I just wanted to let you know, she's drawing from themes and the field work from a larger ethnographic project, which was also published in a book form called Feeding Desire, Beauty and Sexuality Among a Saharan People. And that was published in 2003. So if you're interested in this short article, you may also be interested in this book that is a very interesting book. So that's really all I have to say from the readings for this week. I would like you in your groups to discuss them. In particular, you're going to focus on Popindo's text then. And I want you to think about applying some of Henry's ideas and some of the ideas then that I provide here in the slideshow that are not necessarily discussed at any length in Hendry's, but apply them to Pope and Doe's text. So return back to Victor Turner's three sources of data. Look at Pope and Doe's text and see if you can find examples of these three forms, right? What is the, first of all, body is the symbol. What's the external form, observable characteristics of the kinds of bodies she's looking at? Excuse me. What specialists and laymen does she look to? And what kinds of context is she looking at? These sorts of bodies are contrasted to what other kinds of bodies, and what sorts of groups are they telling us about? You could also look a little or think a little bit about how Pope and Doe's perspective is very much that of, right, the body as text, or the body as artifact. So how do these body ideals, or how do these particular big bodies that she describes reflect various systems of classification? And of course, one of the things you have to do when you're thinking about this question is think about what systems of classification, what do these bodies tell us about this society, right? And to some extent, by contrast to the thin bodies, the Western ideal of the thin body, what sorts of things does she try to suggest there as well? And then think a little bit about, does Pope and Doe examine the body as an agent, and perhaps an agent of change? So think about, does female fatness provide for these women any way of exercising agency in their own lives? And think about, she tries to give some attention to that, and think about in what ways it may. So that's what I'd like you to focus on this week within your group. So that is, it should read group discussion for this week. And then I thought we'd just do another side class activity for fun. I put an article up in the symbol folder that I found this morning on the web. It's just a little one-page article written on a blog by an anthropologist about how rituals also, especially in troubled times, give us a sense of control and calm and continuity. We certainly read about that last week with Hendry, when she talks about that function of ritual also in her text. Excuse me. And so so as I was reading this article, I was also preparing brunch for my family, and I realized that we had been doing Sunday brunch already outside of quarantine, but it became particularly important during quarantine, has become particularly important. So I figured that perhaps all of you in your particular context were also beginning or starting to establish particular ritual activities. And perhaps you could share a picture or word about a ritual that you're participating in that plays this function. Here's a link, I've created just a Google Docs if you want to just upload a picture and a few words. And write your name about such a ritual. You could, of course, also ask others what they're doing as well. You don't have to necessarily share one of your own. You could ask your friends what sorts of things they're doing in a similar sort of way. And then I thought once we gathered enough pictures and enough comments, perhaps we'd have something to say, or patterns to look for about ritual and symbolic activity in COVID-19. I, of course, was also thinking about this, and I should have put class and or journal activity. I was, of course, also thinking of this for your COVID journals. We had a long discussion last week about what to write in your journals. And when I was reading this short piece, and when I was thinking of my own Sunday brunch, I thought this could be perhaps an interesting thing to write about in your COVID-19 journals that you're working on now. So the PowerPoint really should read class activity and journal idea. All right, that's it for now. I'm going to stop here, and I'll upload this tonight, and we'll discuss in class tomorrow. Great, thanks, bye.